located in Indian country. There are 22 tribal nations in Arizona. ASU's campuses are situated on the homelands of many indigenous peoples, including the Akimel, O'odham, and Peepash.
Arizona State University recognizes the original inhabitants of these lands
and recognizes that they still reside throughout the Phoenix metropolitan area.
And we recognize the impact of their wisdom and generosity towards us.
If you've flown into the valley, you have undoubtedly seen the Salt River Project canals that surround the area.
Those modern-day canals follow the framework of the canals originally constructed by ancestral Sonoran Desert people, Huhulcam, to make this area both livable and a place where peoples could thrive.
We acknowledge that the modern-day indigenous nations that descended from the ancestral peoples are the original inhabitants of this land.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication and the downtown Phoenix campus of Arizona State University. This is part 2 of today's CronkiteLIVE, Trust in the Media, Thursday, a special CronkiteLIVE afternoon. First, I'd like to welcome some special guests who are here with us today. Cronkite Endowment Board members David Bodney, Gordon James, and Liz Burns and her husband, Richard. Thank you all for being here and thank you for your continued support. We really want to also recognize the Burns for their generous support and steadfast support of the important work that we do here at the Cronkite School. You've heard a lot about the forces that have eroded trust in the media over the years, but there has been far less attention on how the traditional standard of objectivity has eroded as well. This event will feature Cronkite faculty, former executive editor of the Washington Post, Leonard Downie Jr., and former president of CBS News, Andrew Heyward, discussing their report, Beyond Objectivity, producing trustworthy news in today's newsrooms. This report and the accompanying guidelines serve as a roadmap for restoring trust in journalism built on fair, fact-based reporting. That's not an easy task in this tumultuous media landscape, but it is a vital one. Cronkite faculty members Downie and Heyward argue that the concept of objectivity has lost its relevance for a new generation of journalists and news consumers. Instead, they make the case and provide a playbook for producing trustworthy news in today's and tomorrow's changing newsrooms. With support from the Stanton Foundation and the help of a talented team of Cronkite students, the authors were able to interview more than 75 news leaders and other practitioners and draw insights from the best practices across print, digital, and broadcast news organizations. Today, with help from our moderator, Senior Associate Dean Rebecca Blatt, you'll discover actionable guidelines to help today's newsroom. And with that, I'd like to introduce Andrew Heyward, Lynn Downie, and Dean Blatt. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean Batts, and thank you to our panelists for joining us. There's a lot to talk about here and a lot to unpack. Start by telling us a little bit about the origin of this project.
Happy to. Thank you very much for having us. So quickly, and by the way, the format here is going to be a conversation, so get ready, okay? You're going to help us by doing a lot of the work. But very quickly, we at Cronkite got an email from the Stanton Foundation, as in Frank Stanton, who was one of the founders of CBS, and the only stipulation was we'd like to see a suggestion for a project involving journalistic objectivity. Didn't say anything more than that, so several of us submitted ideas. I didn't think mine would prevail because I actually said, well, I think the traditional notion of objectivity has now become suspect, exactly as Dean Batts said in his introduction. So what I'd like to do is study how we create a roadmap for fairness, accuracy, thoroughness in today's environment. Not for advocacy journalism, not for biased journalism, for non-biased journalism that's going to be credible to a new generation of reporters and consumers who think that the old version of objectivity was too narrow. And as we'll discuss, the criticism of it was not that the underlying idea of fairness is wrong, it's profoundly right, but the execution, led by a very monochromatic set of news leaders, translation, white men, ended up leaving out a lot of other people in the newsroom and in the community. And newsrooms and communities are now becoming more diverse, and we think that the culture of the newsroom needs to embrace that diversity in a way that ensures a new way of reaching that goal of fairness and accuracy. So that was the genesis. Once we got the nod from Stanton, I was incredibly lucky to find out that my colleague, Len Downie, hasn't used the word objectivity in years in the classes that he teaches here, and he very kindly agreed to collaborate on this report. And Len was going to tell us a little bit about some of the key guidelines and findings, and then we want to open this up. We can either talk about the objectivity debate, as we'll tell you, there's been some controversy about our findings, or about the guidelines themselves. We want to talk about what you're interested in here, and that's why we're here. And also, most importantly, what Dean Blatt is interested in. I know where my bread is buttered. Len.
Thank you. We were surprised, I think, to say that when we conducted all those interviews with editors across the country, local television news people, national television news people, the people that are really guiding so much of the media right now, that this is a revolutionary time for them. They are making changes to better cover diverse communities and a diverse country. With the help and sometimes with arguments with younger journalists, like some of you are going to be, who are much more diverse than the people who are principally peopled the media for a long time. And that includes, among other things, involving younger journalists of diverse backgrounds in decision-making in newsrooms and conversations in newsrooms. Editors who are willing to listen to the staff, who create means for listening to the staff, create conversation groups that analyze the way in which they've been covering the news, that come up with ideas for new ways to cover the news. People from different backgrounds who can bring different perspectives to covering the news. As Andrew said, that does not mean being biased. It does not mean not having accurate coverage, but actually having more accurate coverage by the fact that they're able to bring different backgrounds and different sensibilities to the discussions. So we came up with this playbook that we are now testing on news organizations. Just recently here, yesterday and today, here in Arizona, we spoke with the Arizona Republic, worked with them yesterday, with Channel 15 yesterday and Channel 5 today, and we found that these newsrooms are also much more diverse than they'd been in the past, and they're beginning to explore a lot of these things themselves, and so we think that our playbook is helpful to that. So I'm just going to quickly, for the sake of the students here, go through this very fast, our playbook, to give you a context for what it is we're talking about. Strive not just for accuracy, but for truth. And truth obviously is an absolute, but you can pursue the truth all the time. Or as Carl Bernstein always said during Watergate and afterwards, the best possible version of the truth that you can find with your work. Unlock the real power of diversity, inclusion, and identity. It's one thing to have a diverse newsroom. It's another thing to allow people to live their diversity within their work in the newsroom. As Andrew likes to say, in times past, in decades past, The few gay people in the newsroom, the few black people in the newsroom had to figure out ways to behave like those white male people who ran the newsrooms, and not to bring up different ways of covering the news or different ideas about what the stories ought to be. Create a clear and consistent policy to guide your journalist social media and political activity. We may be asked about this by Rebecca later, talk about it more, but this is something obviously that's come with the digital age, is that journalists have access to the public directly, not through their not just through their news organization. And how should that be? Should they be allowed to express views about things that they're covering? Should they be allowed to criticize colleagues or their own news organization in public social media? These are things that news organizations need to wrestle with and need to have clear policies for. Focus on enterprise, investigative, and accountability reporting. Information is everywhere now. As Wesley Lowery said in an earlier panel here, everybody now can be a publisher. Everybody can report news. Everybody can give you information. And the question is, how reliable is that? But what everybody can't do is do the kind of professional journalist approach to enterprise, investigative, and accountability reporting, and give the public information about things that they need that they're not going to get from any other source than professional journalism. Show your work. This is becoming increasingly important as trust for the news media declines. Where did that come from? Was that is that representative of the entire interview, that quote that you used in your story? Where does that data come from? Can I look at that data and see if you came to the right conclusion about it? What was the transcript of that meeting that you're reporting on, if that's published someplace online? What are the documents that you relied on that people can look at? And it's now possible, obviously, with the internet, to provide this information directly to the public outside your stories, and to say inside your story with links, the links that we're all familiar with. You'll use this link in order to see the document that we're quoting from in this story. Define your newsroom's core values and live by them. This is an increasing debate in the news media about to what extent news organizations ought to have core values besides just trying to tell the truth. So, for instance, the Washington Post has over its masthead now its goal, which is democracy dies in darkness, and they've established a big democracy coverage team. And then the New York Times went and followed up on that and established their own democracy coverage team. And so that's clearly a value for those two news organizations, is that they need to be doing journalism that it involves the current crisis in democracy in this country. I think that's all six. That's all six.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And for those of you who haven't seen the report or read the report, it's really, really interesting and detailed, and I think really worth going through the explanation of all six of those recommendations.
And you can Google it. You can Google the report.
Beyond Objectivity.
Right.
And you'll find it there. This has created quite a stir among journalism circles, and I want to ask you both about some of the critique or criticism as we try to understand what the nature of this discussion is really about and where there's agreement and where there isn't. So I want to show a couple of examples of this. There were opinion columns in both the Washington Post and the New York Times about this. And I want to just look at two quotes. One is from the report itself, and I'm sorry, I can't read that far away. This is from a former director of digital news, NPR. As a journalist of color, I've been told time and again that my identity doesn't matter, that I have to shed it all to worship at the altar of objectivity. I bristle at that notion. My lived experiences should inform what I cover. We heard a lot of this sort of echoed with Wes Lowery earlier. And this is one of the critiques from Phil Boas in the Arizona Republic. And he wrote this: if there's a major theme in the Cronkite report, it is that heterosexual white male editors misuse their authority and the standard of objectivity to rigorously impose a narrow vision of the country. The Cronkite report fairly drips with contempt for straight white male editors, amply quoting their critics. So I'm trying to understand in the conversation about objectivity and the extent to which that is what we aspire to be, or we're trying to get beyond that term, how much of the critique and the sort of back and forth is really about power, challenging or defending the power of straight white men versus actually talking about a practice of journalism?
The problem is that the straight white men were the entire newsrooms for decades. And then objectivity was their view of the world, was their view of how to conduct journalism, and other voices. And then it gradually, as newsrooms gradually became more diverse, their view of how journalism should be conducted still prevailed. Phil is fortunate to have an editor who we worked with just yesterday, who recognizes this and is making changes in his own newsroom, as indeed many of the editors across the country are making changes in their newsroom in order to take advantage of the diversity of their staffs. So I think this is definitely something important to continue to go on in journalism.
Just to add to that, not only do we not have contempt for white male editors, what do you think we are? So I don't have contempt for the editors. I have dismay and regret at some of the stories that were slow to emerge in newsrooms dominated by a kind of monotheistic point of view, the theism being the worship of this narrow standard of objectivity. Again, as Len said so well, we're not saying throw the underlying idea of objectivity out the window. We're saying bring it back through the window, but explain it in a way that makes sense to a new generation of consumers and news people.
I can give you an example from when I was editor of the Washington Post. When AIDS first surfaced as a problem in the United States, it was not, I certainly, and most of my other senior editors, were slow to recognize what it was and how dangerous it was. There were gay members of our staff, some of whom were in the closet, which I regret, and I tried not to have that necessarily be the case. But there was one gay member of the staff who was not in the closet who came to me and said, "You're missing a big story. You're missing something that is a really serious problem for this country." And I made her the first AIDS beat reporter in the country.
Sorry, Rebecca, very quickly, and here's an example that I think Phil would agree with. I think mainstream media, as objective as it was, missed the Trump phenomenon and was surprised when there turned out to be a large segment, very large, of the American population that felt disenfranchised, not seen, not heard, not listened to, and angry enough at Washington, at the media, at established institutions to bring a complete outsider, a businessman, into the White House. And afterwards, there's hand-wringing and, we ought to be spending more time in the Midwest. Yeah, but the point is you have, again, it was, nobody could say that we weren't objective, but we missed this giant story to our shame.
Right, I would add to that many communities in the United States, the kind he's talking about, but also African American communities around the country, Hispanic communities around the country, simply weren't being covered because those white editors didn't live there, didn't understand them, didn't know very much about them. And we're now seeing that sort of coverage increase as a result of the diversity of the staffs.
One of the points we make in the report, 10 seconds, blacks and Latinos lost faith in the media before Trump voters did.
Are there things that you would do differently now, Andrew? You are an executive in a national network. Are there things, having done the report and made these recommendations, that you would have done differently now?
Like Len, I tried to create a culture where people could speak truth to power. I think I was reasonably successful at that. But yeah, I think based on what I see now, I think I would have made even more of an effort to have multiple perspectives. And again, you can't have every single perspective in every single story, but you can consider multiple perspectives when you select your stories and when you decide what aspects of the stories are going to be covered. Story selection doesn't get enough attention as a way to express the values of a news organization. Story selection will change to the degree that you listen to the people in the newsroom rather than just rely on the judgment of a single top-down editor model.
And I want to take that a step further, because it's not just the story selection, but also the sources you include, the sources you interview, and then the sources you include, right? And I want to think about that idea of both sidesism, which is mentioned in the report, and I feel like in several of the critiques, that's something that people have have jumped into. So this was from Brett Stevens' column in the New York Times. What Downie and Heyward dismiss in their report as both sidesism is in reality a crucial way to build trust with audiences. Particularly in a country as diverse as America, it gives a platform to multiple views, and it shows faith that people can come to intelligent conclusions of their own. Can you talk about what you mean by both sidesism? What is this really about?
False equivalent. He's not really addressing that in those remarks. I don't disagree with the latter part of his remarks at all. But the false equivalence was a problem. Think back to the early coverage of climate change, when news stories, including our newspaper, I regret for a while, presented the scientists' concerns about the future of the climate in the United States, and then you had to have the people who were opposed to that in the story equally. We would, in doing profiles, this literally is true, in doing profiles, this is now several decades ago, of the presidential candidates during the primary season, I would make sure that all of them were exactly the same length. And that was foolish, because some of those candidates were going nowhere. That was not news judgment, to make sure that they were all the same length. So it's that false equivalence that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, Brett Stevens, A, is brilliant, and more importantly, excuse me, he's not here to defend himself, but this was not his best work, this column. I urge you to read it afterwards if you haven't read it yet. At one point, I'll
tell him that next time he and I debate at the telephone.
I wish you would. At one point in the column, he accuses us of dismissing every single achievement that brilliant white inventors and thinkers have made over the centuries, which is absolutely absurd. But he's just mischaracterizing our views here. We're in favor of gathering multiple perspectives in news gathering and presenting them as journalistically appropriate. Both sidesism is a journalistic sin. Gathering multiple perspectives is a journalistic mandate.
In fact, there aren't two sides to most things. There are many different ways, many different perspectives. You need to consider all of them in your coverage, but then you also may need to draw some conclusions from it. That's the whole purpose of being a journalist, is to do all that reporting, that investigating, and then giving the readers the best possible.
And one more thing, Rebecca, in response to your initial question, I think there were two kinds of attacks, and this represented kind of an attack from the right. He's a conservative columnist, because there's an understandable fear that there'll be like a wave of wokeness that washes over newsrooms, and what they're afraid of is that we'll represent replace one orthodoxy with another, and and so the idea is we've got to stand up for objectivity as a bulwark against this political correctness that we're worried is going to engulf the news business.
What recommendations do you have for Cronkite students as they go through the kinds of editorial processes that you're talking about? What story am I pitching here? Who am I going to interview? What conclusions? When do I draw a conclusion versus just letting something sit as it is? How do you think that in having so many diverse opportunities to talk with so many, how do you then narrow down what you're going to cover and who you're going to talk to and who you're going to include?
Well, you're trying to understand what is factually accurate. And so you do want to make your reporting as broad as possible in order to get the information from as many different kind of sources as possible. I mean, a classic example of that in a narrow way is covering police activity, where police have PIOs who give you a certain version of what happened last night, and it is usually not correct. It's usually not full.
And yet for years, by the way, in the era of objectivity, it was accepted as gospel way too long.
Exactly. Police said I wrote some of those stories in 1965 or whatever it was when I covered the police. And I wasn't going out and interviewing neighbors of what happened. I wasn't asking a police watchdog group, if one existed back then, their interpretation of this police shooting. That just wasn't done then. And it's hard work, is what it is. It's trying to find all the different kinds of information you can from as many a variety of sources as you can. But another thing that we've been advocating in these workshops we've been conducting with news organizations about the report is to get out in your community, to learn your communities. This city is obviously one of the best examples of that. I mean, there's more variety in this community than many other parts of the country, and so if you're only focusing on one or two parts of it, either because real estate is really interesting in Scottsdale, or police shootings are a problem in this particular neighborhood, you're not covering other things that really matter. The Arizona Republic, when we met with them yesterday, told us something we didn't know, which is they've hired a bilingual journalist who is meeting with people in the community, creating community meetings, and learned that one of the biggest issues in the Hispanic community is housing. And so they're creating a new beat for that as a result of feedback from the community. Some news organizations, Andrew can tell you more about this, some local television stations around the country are actually sending reporters into the communities to live in the communities, young reporters to live in the communities and bring back information that older reporters downtown would not have found out.
So just to add, I think there are two fantastic opportunities. Never a better time to be a Cronkite student for these two reasons. One is the journalism we do here is not governed by ratings and circulation as much as it is in the commercial world. And so there is an opportunity to dive deeply and to find added value and find stories that are not being done by conventional media and perform a real service that way. The reason that's an even bigger opportunity is that's where the rest of journalism is starting to go, especially on the TV side. The kind of generic voiceover, the crime that happened in a routine crime story that has been the meat and potatoes of local news isn't going to fly in an on-demand economy. If you think about it, as the news consumption pattern changes, as the next generation comes of age that's never going to tune in to the 5, 6, 10, or 11, and everything is going to be of choice, you're not going to click on a voiceover of a warehouse fire in a neighborhood you wouldn't go to with a sawed-off shotgun. You're going to click on a meaningful story that has some relevance to you. So that's going to put pressure on news organizations to do exactly the kind of journalism they're learning to do here. So not only is there an incredible shortage of reporters and producers in the country that creates a lot of openings for Cronkite students, there's also a demand for the kind of journalism they learn here.
I would add one other thing, is to be as open as possible with your readers and viewers. What is it you don't know about a controversial story or any story? What is, in your reporting, there's something important you've not been able to find out that that the viewer, but a lot of us have this happen all the time when you're watching news on television or reading news someplace. Well, wait a minute, what about this? And all you have to do is say, we don't know that yet. And to show, and also we talk about showing your work, being able to use the modern, this great technology we have now to show other aspects where you got your information from. And when somebody doesn't, when you're seeking comment, for instance, reaction to your stories that you want from the people you're writing about, and if public officials, for instance, aren't talking to you, the police aren't talking to you, say specifically, we called 7 times. We asked the following questions that they did not respond to, so that you're sharing with the reader your actual reporting process, and it's not a mystery anymore, or people won't draw the wrong conclusions from your story because you have not yet told them what it was you couldn't find out.
You're not just saying you're fair, you're showing you're fair by doing that.
Right. I want to talk about the generational aspect of the research
Don't we have something besides bread up there while we're talking?
Yes. Hang on.
Thank you, Rebecca.
I'm going to tell him that too.
Yeah.
I should say in advance of this column, I wrote a column in the Washington Post at the invitation of the editorial page, an editorial column, that summarized the report. And that's what everybody's been reacting to. A number of conservative media organizations around the country, probably many of you haven't even heard of and don't read, felt it was really important to respond to this report in a way in which they essentially accused us of saying, we're going to freeze conservatives out, we want to slant the news in this particular way that is not going to be good for those people. And so when Brett contacted me to say that he wanted to respond to the report, I said, fine, let's have a telephone conversation, which turned into a really good debate for half an hour. I mean, we were shouting at each other. And there are aspects of his column, actually, that we're not in disagreement with, which I think grew out of that particular conversation.
So to circle back to the something that Wes said earlier today, he talked about a rising generation. This is something that I've heard you all say too. And he said they insist upon a level of parity in the newsroom and in our industry, who are willing to call out things they don't like, who are very resistant to doing things that they think might be causing harm. And it sounds like, that that sort of generational change in thinking about what we should be doing and why we should be doing it is putting a lot of power behind this conversation. And I, on the one hand, am so grateful for that. And one of the reasons I'm at the Cronkite School is because I'm so inspired by students who really are going to be driving the future of what we do and defining what that is. It also, though, seems like, wow, that's a lot of power that young people have been able to wield in driving this conversation forward. And I'm wondering how that is. How is it that young people have been able to raise these issues to an extent that we're having this conversation?
Well, as newsrooms shrink and economic problems exist for the media, a larger proportion of newsrooms are now younger people. And at the same time, many news organizations purposely want to make their newsrooms more diverse. So that's why you have a larger group of these journalists in newsrooms than you may have had before. Our response to that is that they need to be involved in the conversation. And in a variety of ways, whether it's creating groups of diverse journalists in the newsroom, which many newspapers are now doing and television stations are now doing, who have their own conversations about things that concern them, and then bring them to the top editors or involve the top editors in those conversations to begin with. But what we want to make clear, though, is that this is not to be advocacy. It's to bring new points of view, new ways of considering things, subjects that haven't been covered before or haven't been covered in the best way before, but not to be advocates. And there are some young journalists in some newsrooms. The editor of the Washington Post told me that there are advocates in her newsroom on issues like education. And you have to deal with that. They're smart, they're bright, they're doing good reporting, and they have to understand they're not the editorial page. But at the same time, they have to be heard in making decisions about coverage. You have a good phrase about what that role is, which I can't remember right now.
I'm not sure. I'll think of it as you go.
Okay.
But I'd make a distinction between the conversation in the newsroom and then the behavior on the street. I think we're really advocating a very open newsroom culture, a so-called safe space where people can speak truth to power, and they can advocate for things that, especially when they grow out of their own life experience, they have credibility there. That's turning diversity into a superpower, drawing on the life experience of the people who work there for insight into what you should be covering it. But then you leave your bias at the door when you go out on the street. And if anything, you say to those same people who are passionate about changing the country, you still have to back up everything you say with fair, accurate, substantive reporting. And if you do that, I think you get a richer form of journalism.
Right. You want to leave your bias aside, but you want your experience to be able to inform your reporting, to seek out sources that you might not have sought out before if you were a different kind of person.
And what I would say to the students here is, as you're looking for jobs, in addition to thinking about market size and the news reputation of the organization you're thinking of joining, see if you can do some investigating of what the culture is like, a culture that's going to welcome the kind of discussion we're advocating.
I want to make sure that we invite students and faculty to come to the microphone and share a question or a thought or perception about the conversation we're having. And as Albert is making his way to the microphone to ask a question, I'm also curious to hear from our panelists after Albert has, but just to plant a seed for those of you sitting here, what you think the Cronkite School should be teaching about objectivity and how we can best prepare you to be in positions of having a voice in this conversation. Go ahead, Albert.
Hi, my name is Albert. I'm a graduate student here in the Masters of Investigative Journalism program. And I first wanted to say thank you. I think this is a really important conversation to have, especially looking within ourselves as an industry, and especially for gentlemen such as yourself with a long-standing career. But I wanted to touch on your point about bias and objectivity, about being able to speak in a newsroom, but refraining from that outside of it. A lot of people, queer people of color, queer indigenous people of color, our existence is political. That is not a choice, it just is. And although, yes, there is a need to remove that bias from my reporting, to not have a stance or a voice outside of the newsroom is to stay silent and to essentially die. And how can we maintain that balance? Because we do need to be active outside of the newsroom. We don't have to necessarily do it as journalists, But to remove it altogether is to erase part of our identity, and I wonder how you would suggest we handle those situations.
Well, I'll start, but I know Leonard's thought a lot about this too. I mean, I think we shouldn't be afraid to embrace the complexity and nuance of the situation that you're describing. This is not simple at all. To the extent that reporting and journalism reflects a predisposition, a point of view that you left with, and an advocacy position, you will erode trust with the customers, in my view, and actually hurt the organization and probably hurt the cause that's important to you. So that's thing one. I think as I said earlier, I think life experience and a passion for particular causes should inform story selection, should inform the conversation in the newsroom, and there are many ways for a journalist to have the kind of influence you're talking about in those areas. I still think the reporting itself needs to be open-minded to multiple points of view, and rigorously, and Wesley Lowery, we interviewed him for the report, would say the exact same thing. He would say it's still a journalist's job. Maybe he said it. I was doing something else at the station, got here late. Go out, look at things and write them down, right? So the observed reality is still the core value of a journalist, obviously, with interpretation on top. You give up certain, in our view, and again, you can argue with us, you give up certain rights of free expression when you join a news organization, in our view. This is a very controversial area. We say in the report Len and I are small c conservatives in this area, but I don't think it helps a news organization to allow on social media, even on personal accounts, to allow the journalists to take stands on controversial issues. I think that you say that I'm going to try to change the world as a journalist, not as an advocate, and I give up certain rights.
Remember, we're talking about trustworthy news presentation that will be trusted by the public, and the public's already skeptical about that. And if you are in your life doing things that evidence a certain point of view in your activities, that reflects in your news organization, and then people will say that news organization is biased in this way or that way, and that degrades your reporting. People will not trust your reporting if they disagree with your other activities. I mean, we're old guys. And so when I ran the Washington Post, which I did for 24 years, first under Ben Bradley and then as his successor, I stopped voting. We also had, because I was the final, I didn't think the rest of the staff had to stop voting, but I was the final decider of what went in the newspaper every day and on the website every day. And so I did not want to decide who ought to be president of the United States. I often wonder if I had still been editor of the Post during when Trump was running for president, what would I have done? It's hard to say, because he's sort of outside the norm of American politics. But you want your news organization to be trusted. You want your reporting to be trusted. And also, you may change your mind about things as time goes on. As journalists are trying to find things out and come to conclusions based on what they find out, not just what's inside their head, what's inside their heart, but what the facts are. And so I think if you choose that profession, now you can be an opinion person, be an opinion writer. Yesterday we were doing a workshop with the Arizona Republic, and the editorial page editor made clear she's going to have opinions. But she's going to join the conversation in the newsroom because that's useful. It's useful for everybody else to hear about. But she's opinions, and you're not.
But we deal with this at great length in the report. This issue that you've raised.
Yes.
If I can follow up.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, so everybody can hear you.
Sorry. Not to monopolize time, I apologize. But to follow up on that, I understand the concern for hurting the publication, but then at what point does our own existence matter and our own defense of ourselves outside of being journalists matter? I mean, personally speaking, when I see laws against queer people being enacted across the country, I don't know where to do. I'm being asked to be objective and remain silent outside of the newsroom.
We're not asking you to be objective, but we're asking you to be a journalist, which is to say the role of a journalist with that is to do the reporting on damage done by these kinds of laws, by why do people want to have these kinds of laws, what is the impact on queer people of these laws, what is the overall context of that in the country at this point in its history, and that's your role if you choose to be a journalist. If you choose to be an activist, then you be an activist, which is also a very important role.
But you can influence the weight of the coverage towards that trend.
Yes.
And that's very valuable and actually helps people understand that this is potentially, a threat to our social fabric. Without you getting on a soapbox and saying it.
I've always said journalism is a calling. It's not a normal job. It's a calling.
Hi, my name is Francesca. I am a graduate student in the investigative journalism program. So my question is about, well, these recommendations are excellent. They're ultimately, though, up to editors and management in the newsroom. And at some point, some of us, many of us, might be faced with an editor who wants to sanitize a story or both sides of a story for fear of criticism, or because they just can't see the story, maybe. And if we push back a lot, our livelihood could be on the line. And I'm wondering what your recommendations are for workers in that situation who are not management.
Golly, work someplace else. I know that's easy to say and hard, but I wouldn't want to work for an editor like that.
Yeah, that's what I was saying about investigating the culture carefully. Obviously, you can't have complete visibility into a news culture, but one of the nice things about the online world is you can learn a lot about what newsrooms are like with a little bit of research. But yeah, I mean, that's just not a healthy culture to work in. So we would say, and if you're stuck there, do great work that gets you out of there to a better place.
Right, and I believe that a lot of progress has been made. I believe there are fewer editors like that now, including, I mean, obviously the people we interviewed are not like that at all.
I think the my way or the highway crowd is increasingly finding itself on the highway.
Right, right.
That's good to hear.
Hi, my name is Adrienne. I'm an investigative journalism student in the grad program. My question was about, in the beginning you mentioned that newsrooms were ran by what you called white men, straight white men. So my question is, what kind of thought process went into determining, the culture of the newsroom in the past? And was there any thought to, someone might argue, elitist or privileged individuals? Because if it's not a white man, but they still come from the same background, it's a similar conversation.
Okay, I'll be quick. I think that's a real problem. And again, I alluded earlier to mainstream media missing the Trump voter was an example of that kind of elitism. The media was slow to recognize that because they surrounded themselves with, other tall, ruggedly handsome white people like Len. There wasn't a lot of pushback. What you've seen happen now, it's much more dramatic with women than it is with people of color. We still have way more progress that we need to make with people of color. But in local news, which is what I study as a research professor, the women have moved into leadership in very significant numbers. In fact, in the top, Liz, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but in the top 50 markets, the majority of news directors are women now. So that changes that culture, at least in terms of understanding what's important to a giant part of the audience. In terms of the elitism, we want to define diversity broadly, not just by race and gender, but also by educational background, income background, military record, religious affiliation. Really try to bring people in with multiple points of view to attack that very phenomenon you're describing.
And editors of newspapers are becoming increasingly diverse. It was interesting when we did this research to encounter how many of them are now. And it just was the Atlanta Journal-Constitution just appointed its first black editor, I think. They're becoming increasingly diverse. This is a good development. This is increasingly happening.
LA Times, I mean, there's a huge one.
Yeah, oh yeah, LA Times, San Francisco Chronicle.
I remember you.
So what kind of conversation was that like when you were kind of determining, the conversation around objectivity and what does it mean to bring diversity in? Was it like a conversation more about like identity group, or was it about just like where you come from?
Well, I would say that back in the day, people have been interested in statistical diversity for a long time. But as Len said earlier, you'd bring people in, ironically, because they were, quote unquote, different, but then you'd make them act the same. You kind of sand them down so that they would fit in. The change that we see happening now and that we think should happen even faster is You bring people in because they're different, and you embrace that difference as a way to enrich your journalism as well as your newsroom culture.
And engage in, have a newsroom culture in which everyone feels they can participate, both based on their backgrounds, based on their work, and to make sure that it's not just one person making the final decision.
Hello, gentlemen. I'm Pauline Arriaga, and I'm the executive editor of News 21. And Len, thank you again for coming with Kelly McBride to have a conversation with my students recently about this very issue. I'm going to stumble my way through a point and then a question. And I hear what Albert is saying, and I do think it's important to acknowledge that making a decision to vote or not to vote, making a decision to express an opinion about your politics is different than being gay, being black, being Latina, being an immigrant, and having that be part of who you actually are and feeling like you have to then hide who you are.
You don't have to hide.
Yeah, and as we know, newsrooms are grappling with that very, very thing, right? So my old shop, the Associated Press, they're grappling with it, and now I'm hearing things like, of course you can say Black Lives Matter, just please in your Twitter handle do not link to the organization Black Lives Matter. So one of my questions, one piece of advice I give to my students is what you all are saying. Research your organizations, research where you're going to work. And there may very well be nonprofits now, organizations now, outlets that actually do fit more in line with who you are and what you want to be as a journalist. So all of this leads to, can you talk a little bit more about places like the 19th and some of the other newer outlets, more niche outlets, in terms of what they're grappling with their journalists and how they're navigating this? And thank you for letting me kind of put that out there.
Right. No, and I agree with what you said in your premise too. I understand the conflict. This is a very good subject. We talk in here about whether newsrooms ought to have value statements. In fact, we encourage newsrooms to have value statements, at least internally, so you know what democracy dies in darkness. You want to be pro-democracy, for example. And associated with that is that some things are facts and not opinions. The fact that Black Lives Matter is a fact. The fact that Donald Trump has lied many times is a fact. And many news organizations now cite lies instead of saying, well, the other side of this is X. No, he lied. And there are many different kinds of, this is something that wasn't done before in the media, but there are many different instances in which stating something that's true is something you ought to do, even if some other people may think that's opinion, and that's an important distinction. And it's not something that's easily done. I mean, it has to be figured out each time that you decide to do that. But also some newsrooms, both mainstream newsrooms and particularly startup newsrooms that have a particular audience in mind, are beginning to state their particular values. So the 19th, for instance, its values are to respect women and to respect gay people, for example, and those are their values, and that's fine. So you can establish those values, and you can make them public if you choose to make them public. Want to say more about that?
Just that I think it's a welcome trend. I mean, let 1,000 flowers bloom, but living up to your values, I think, is important. So if you're passionate about climate change, there are going to be news organizations devoted entirely to that. There's the Marshall Project is devoted to criminal justice reform, but we spoke to the founder of it, Neil Barsky, one of our interviewees. He made the point, we still adhere to journalistic standards. We're still out there doing reporting, but we're doing reporting. The underlying premise is the justice system is badly flawed and in need of reform, and we live up to that value in what we do.
And then people who are audiences for those they know what they're the audience for, but they also know that they're still going to be accurate and fair. The 19th is very good at that. It's a very sound news organization, but aimed at a particular audience, focused on specific subjects with specific values.
Hi, Len. Hi, Rebecca. Andrew, I'm TJ. I was one of Len's students last semester. I'm glad that Adrian brought up this point that that I thought was really interesting from the discussion about missing the Trump phenomenon, missing the election, and all that came with it. And we do talk a lot about, you know, the need to be more diverse and have more diverse opinions, you know, and we, you know, from what we learn, we're thinking about the history of journalism, coming from a place where in the 20th century it became a much more refined, rigorous product that news organizations were putting out. You know, as a result of more education and training in that field, perhaps. But you know, the perhaps, you know, at the same time, where you know, the industry or mainstream media misses stuff like the Trump phenomenon. So I was wondering if you could talk about a little bit about that balance of how we go out of this, you know, how in you know, an ethical way we go outside of this bubble. And then second, another question, as writers, you get to think about the audience. So when you guys were writing this, I'm wondering, you know, who do you want to hear this? Who's the audience? Who do you think needs to hear it most? That kind of thing.
Why don't I answer the second question, which is easier, and you can take the tough one on. So I think, again, you know, I've jokingly said that, you know, the media world is becoming an embarrassment of niches. And I think we're going to find much narrower and narrower focus news organizations, to the earlier point about, you know, special interest news organizations. So knowing your audience is really going to be increasingly important. We're moving from a world of broadcasting to narrowcasting, where, and digital really enables this, where you can target specific audiences. So understanding whom you are speaking to, whom you want to reach, doesn't mean you don't try to broaden that reach, but I think the idea of one-size-fits-all journalism is partly how we got into trouble. So I think understanding that there are multiple audiences out there, reaching out to members of the community that might not feel heard, seen, represented in your journalism is critically important, but then you want to serve them once you've found them.
And the answer to your first question could be just one word, which is reporting. But I'll expand on that. Insufficient reporting was done about Trump's background, about the aggrieved Americans who are prepared to vote for him but are not on television at the time. Now they are. And we're not on television at the time. We're not obvious. People were not going out and doing reporting. I'll tell you a little story. When Jimmy Carter was running for re-election against Ronald Reagan, I was the London correspondent of the Washington Post. And the American embassy, I had high visibility as the London correspondent of the Washington Post. So the American embassy decided to have a discussion about the election. This is in the late weeks of the election. And invited George Will, who happened to be in London at the time, and myself. And I had to answer the question first. We talked about a lot of things, but I had to answer the question first about what was going to happen in the election. I said, well, it's very rare for an American president to not be reelected. George Will's answer was Reagan in a landslide, because he was in touch with what was going on in the country. I wasn't. I was in London. But also, I was so embarrassed by that once the election was over, as I looked back over the coverage, and including the Washington Post, I did not see very much coverage of a malaise that was going on in the country during Carter's administration. There was coverage of the individual problems, but not how it was affecting voters. However, a columnist for the Washington Post named Haynes Johnson, who had been a political reporter, was now a columnist in the style section. The Post's feature section. He crisscrossed the country writing columns about talking to Americans. Nothing about the election at all. Nothing about Carter, nothing about Reagan. But those columns put together, when I read them all together in London, told me this is a country that was very unhappy and looking for a new leader.
Oh, sorry, TJ, I misunderstood you. All right, yeah, well, yeah. Good answer to the wrong question. I misunderstood you, I apologize. We were intending this for the industry. This is meant for, you know, coming from an eminent journalism school under the dean's direction, and we were trying to reach fellow journalists who are coping with, and all up and down the ladder, from people starting out in the field to people who are leaders, trying to advocate, trying to address this problem that we found virtually every newsroom we talked to is having. This problem's a strong word. This difficult conversation that virtually every newsroom is having.
It's good that it's a difficult conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hi, my name is Noelle Lynn Smith, and I'm a student in the investigative journalism program here. I was listening to the comment about like if you have a bad editor and you're a person of color, and maybe you shouldn't be working in that newsroom. Like you should try to find a different newsroom to work in that's a little bit more acceptant. I kind of have to disagree with that because, like, what if you come from a community like me, Navajo Nation, and the newspaper that you're working for has that type of editor, but you don't want to leave because the stories that you're telling matter because part of your readership is, tribal membership. So I kind of a little bit scared about that comment.
Let me just say one thing about that. The question was posed that the editor was actually doing bad things to stories, was actually changing stories for that editor's point of view or their sense of their audience. You can do good work in newsrooms that don't necessarily have great editors. And I would advise students, as I've always advised students over the years, when you're doing the research on a news organization that you may want to work for, don't just look at the editor, look at the other people in the newsroom, because there may be somebody there who will become your particular helper that you'll learn from, as Bob Woodward would say, in defiance of the editor.
But being one of the first of anything in a newsroom is very hard.
Yeah.
And some people thrive on that, other people don't. I think if you have the will and the way to stay and advocate for what you believe, that's great. But I agree with what Len said. I think the premise was an editor who wasn't going to change, wasn't going to listen. So at a certain point, your own happiness, fulfillment, and ability to do good work also has to be considered, as opposed to sacrificing yourself on the altar so that future journalists can benefit. So it's a balancing act that it's a personal decision that people can make. I think you're going to see an increasing number of cultures that welcome dissent and so-called difficult conversations, and that's where I think the best journalists are going to gravitate.
Yes, I'm aware of staying in a newsroom where you're probably undervalued and underappreciated. I've come from that for my career, aside from working at Navajo Times, which has an all Navajo newsroom. But my question about the report is, I'm wondering, did you guys get any feedback from any of the Journalists Association of Color, like Native American Journalism Association, Black, Hispanic, Asian?
Not yet, but we're going to be speaking to some of them. One of our graduate students' assistants is very involved in some of those organizations, and she's working with them for us to be able to work with them.
Any plans to talk to Indian Country Today, which is upstairs?
No, we didn't plan on that. She was talking about Arizona chapters of places, and also the national conferences this summer.
Okay, thank you.
Andres, I think you'll have the last
time?
Last question, too.
Last question, Andres, an honor.
Hello, Andrew and Len. So I'm Andres Martinez, professor of practice here. I worked at 4 newspapers, I think, and 3 of them I was on the opinion side, editorial pages. So I did have a license to have opinions within this news ecosystem. But even then, and I think the way we thought of an editorial page, in the sort of classic structure of the newspaper, which was very separate from the newsroom, we did, we had very clear our core values, and I think the opinion pages, the editorial page, embodied the core values of the institution, but it was asking a lot, I think, of readers, and I remember feeling this at the time, that we're asking a lot of our audience and of readers to, on the one hand, accept that these are the values of this institution, but that these values are not driving what Len Downie's putting on page 1, right? Like that was a lot to ask of our audience, that we're objective, but if you turn to page, A23, 24, you can find out what the owners of this institution really believe and see their core values. And I think over time, that conceit has worn very thin, and it's part of, I think, why there is less trust in this idea that this institution can be objective in doing its core function, when if you look a little bit behind the curtain or turn to a different page, you'll see its values. And so I'm wondering if, and I was thinking about this when you were talking about the 19th and the Marshall Project, and you're saying that they do great work, but we know they're biased, essentially.
wouldn't say bias. We
Well-
know their values.
Right, and so I think there's a
Their
language.
objectives.
Right, I know we're all kind of biased against the term bias, right? That's a pejorative, but I wonder if part of what we're wrestling with here is just sort of accepting that point of view, core values, perspective. If that might not be the model for the future of mainstream, not just niche journalism. Like if you look at the UK, I think they have a slightly different model.
They do.
The Guardian, the Times of London, one's center right, one's left right. I think a lot of Brits would say they do good journalism. It's fair and it's accurate, but it's biased, right? Like I would know for whom the editor of the Guardian or the editor of the Times of London voted. Right. Like, is that maybe not a more credible model for journalism?
No,
Okay,
when I worked as a London correspondent, in order to try to be informed of what the British media are producing, I had to read 7 newspapers every single day. And I still didn't know what was going on.
I'm not saying they're quite as good as the Washington Post
or
the New York Times, but in terms of like people buying that.
And besides, we have that now. There's Fox News. You can go to Fox News if you want, you know. You can go to MSNBC.
I don't think they're accurate or
left.
fair, and I think the Times of London is.
But a more serious answer to your question. Yes, increasingly values are becoming more important in news coverage, and interpretation and analysis and all those kinds of things are becoming more important and becoming not so separate from just the facts, ma'am, as it was in the past. And I think that's going to continue to develop that way, but it's got to be very, very carefully done so that you aren't being biased. There is a difference between bias and values. There is a difference between bias and interpretation and context. And that's what this report tries to wrestle with. And newsrooms are going to continue wrestling with it more than ever before, particularly with these other things going on around the outside of the mainstream media.
Thank you so
Awesome.
much.
Well, mostly just thank you for this report. I'm really proud that Cronkite put this out. And obviously, like you've got us all thinking about
Thank you. He was the driving force.
I was worried you weren't going to read that card I gave you before the, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much to both of you for joining us and for all of your work on this and for continuing to catalyze conversations about the future of our business and the future for our students. Thank you both. Really appreciate it.
Our pleasure. Thank you for coming.